Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel, Adam Draws Stuff. I'm Adam and I draw stuff, and today I'm going to be going over something that seems to be a little bit of a sticking point for a lot of people, and that is blending colored pencils. Blending colored pencils can be a little bit of a challenge. It can be a little bit tricky depending on the materials that you're using, but I'm going to cover 5 different ways of blending. And I have a little diagram here with 5 boxes, and in each box we're going to use a different way or a different method for blending colored pencils. So we'll do layering first, and layering is just going over layer by layer with the colored pencils on the paper with really light layers in multiple directions, and just going over it as many times as possible to really saturate the paper and make sure that none of the texture of the paper is coming through. Then we'll go in with a blender, a colorless blender, and what this is it's too many ises. What this blender is just a pencil that has nothing but binder in it. So most pencils, colored pencils, use wax as a binder. Some use oil, some are oil-based, and the binder is just the sort of the vehicle that carries the pigment and is just the medium that the pigment kind of is held in. So this is a colorless pencil that has just binder in it, and this helps to blend what you've put down already just by adding more binder, and it helps to kind of move the pigment around. Then we will use a blending stump, and these are typically used for graphite drawings, but they do work really well for blending colored pencil as well. So we'll go over that. Burnishing is going to be the 4th method that we use, and burnishing is basically taking the pencil and pressing really hard until you've kind of saturated the paper as much as you can. And there are certain reasons why you would use that and certain reasons why you wouldn't, and we'll cover that as well. The last method that we use, which is one of the most interesting, is using alcohol, just rubbing alcohol and a cotton swab. And that will actually break down the binder a little bit and allow you to blend the pigment more easily than you would otherwise. But again, just like burnishing, just like all of these, really, there's a reason you would use that or a certain application, and plenty of applications where you wouldn't use that. So what we're first going to do is, I have 2 colored pencils, and I just picked a blue and a green, just kind of at random, and I'm going to go through with this first box, and we're going to do the layering technique, which is, like I said earlier, you just go through and add multiple thin layers of color, one on top of the other, and you go in different directions, and as many times as it takes for you to totally saturate the paper. So basically all I'm doing is, as you can see, switching back and forth between the blue and the green and going over it time and time again in different directions, and just trying my hardest to put as much pigment down on the paper as I can without pressing too hard. And the one thing that you will be able to see is because I'm going layer by layer and because I'm working so lightly, you are able to get a really good and really smooth transition and gradient between the 2 colors. Okay, so here is our example done with layering, and as you can see, you can still kind of make out quite a bit of the texture of the paper, and this is because I've gone over it time and time again, but really lightly. So if you're working with textured paper like I am, it can be good because it can really kind of grab onto the pencils and allow you to get more pigment from them, but at the same time it tends to leave kind of a blotchy texture that is really hard to get rid of when you're working lightly. So layering is really good for doing detail work, and it's good for working in small areas, but as far as getting really heavily saturated colors, you still have to go in with something else like a blender or a blending stump and smooth out all of that texture that's left over by the layering process. So next we're going to go in and use our colorless blender, and this is one of my favorite ways of blending actually. It works really well, and what I'm first going to do is similar to this first box here, I'm just going to layer the green and blue together and then go back over it with the colorless blender, and you'll see what makes this so useful and effective. Okay, so here is our second swatch done, and I haven't spent as much time on it as I did with the first, with the layering, the first example over here, because now I want you to see what the colorless blender, how that interacts with the pigment. So if you can see on camera, the colorless blender sort of smashes the pigment into the paper so that it kind of covers up the white spots, or it covers up the texture of the paper with the pigment from the colored pencils. Okay, so here's our swatch done with the colorless blender, and as you can see, it is a lot smoother than the side that we did with layering. And it took out a lot of that mottled pattern, or the kind of speckling from the texture of the paper, and it really did a great job at saturating the paper with the pigment. So you would want to use a blender like this, a colorless blender, if you're working in a small area where you want a lot of detail and control, because these colorless blenders, what they're really great for is getting into small areas where you really want a lot of saturation, but you don't want to give up control by using some of the other blending methods. You can sharpen this, you can get into really tiny areas, and you can really bump up the saturation quite a bit using a colorless blender like this. So next I am going to go over the blending stump. And this is similar to the blender, but what's different about using a blending stump is that the blending stump doesn't add extra binder or an extra carrier to the paper. All it does is kind of smear it around what you put down. So I'm going to add the green and blue again, and we'll be back to see what the blending stump does. Okay, so here's our swatch done using the blending stump. And as you can see, it's still smoother and more saturated than the first one that we did with the layering, but it's not quite as smooth and evenly gradiated as the colorless blender. And the reason that is because the blending stump doesn't have any binder. It doesn't have any of the carrier that the colored pencils use. So it doesn't move the pigment around quite as efficiently as the colorless blenders. You would typically want to use a blending stump in conjunction with the layering technique. So you would layer a bunch of colors down and a bunch of layers on top of each other, and then in between those layers you would use the blending stump to kind of smooth it out a little bit, and then go back over it again with the colored pencil, and then just keep repeating the process, alternating back and forth between your colored pencil and your blending stump. The reason it's a little bit harder to do that with the colorless blender is because every single time you use this colorless blender, it adds more and more of this carrier to your paper. So with each layer that you add colored pencil and then the colorless blender, it makes it harder and harder to continually add more color and more layers. It makes your paper basically unworkable. Whereas the blending stump, since it's not adding anything, it doesn't make the paper unworkable, and you can operate with a few more layers. So next we're going to go in with burnishing. And that is probably one of the most common ways of blending colored pencils. And what that is just simply pressing the colored pencils as hard into your paper as you possibly can, and just getting the area as saturated with color as you can by just using willpower and force to smash it into the paper. So I'm going to do that right now, and we'll take a look at how that's different from the first three. Okay, so here's our example of burnishing, and what you can see just by looking at it is that is definitely the most saturated. And this is probably the most popular way of blending colored pencils. It's also probably my least favorite. Much like using the colorless blender, you're putting so much pigment and carrier from the colored pencils into the paper that it really becomes unworkable. after just one layer of really hard burnishing. But the upside to that is that you can get really saturated colors. You're really only limited by how hard you can press the colored pencil into the paper. And as you can see, it's definitely the most opaque. You can't see any white at all or any texture from the paper, unlike the other three. And it's the most saturated of the four by far. But the only thing to keep in mind is it's a very destructive way of blending. And what I mean by that is once you burnish, it's really hard to add other layers on top of it because the paper becomes completely, it hits its capacity with how much colored pencil or how much pigment it can hold. So once you burnish, you basically can't do anything else on top of it. You're kind of stuck with what you've got. So there's a trade-off there to having really saturated colors. Lastly, we are going to do one of the most interesting, or at least the most fun, ways of blending, which is using our isopropyl alcohol or rubbing alcohol. So I'm going to, again, just like every other time, I'm going to go in with the green and blue colored pencils and give ourselves a base that we can then blend. Okay, so here's our base layer down, and what I'm going to do now is go in with a cotton swab soaked in alcohol and just kind of start rubbing around, and we'll see what happens. As you can see, it's getting pretty saturated and it's starting to blend the colored pencil really well. And how this works is that the alcohol actually breaks up the binder of the colored pencil, which allows you to then smear the pigment around a little bit. And in this case, I'm using Prismacolor pencils, so the binder is wax, and the alcohol is breaking up the wax, which means we can then kind of just smear the base pigments around a little bit. So there is the alcohol method of blending. This has its drawbacks too, just like any of the other methods. I would say that blending with alcohol or any other kind of solvent is best done on large areas where you need to blend smoothly and where it would take maybe too long to burnish it or too long to go layer by layer. Blending with alcohol can allow you to cover a really large space pretty quickly. The downside is that using alcohol and a cotton swab doesn't really give you a whole lot of control. So it's really not great for detail work or getting into really small areas. And the other thing is, it's also really easy to overwork the paper and to overwork the colored pencil. So as you can see, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. As you can see, especially in the blue side, it's a little bit mottled and it's not quite as smooth. And what I would now have to do is wait for the colored pencil to dry and then go back over it again and blend again with alcohol to kind of smooth that blue out and give it a nicer gradient and transition into the green. So it has its upsides and its downsides, but all the methods that I've shown you here today do. So I hope that demystifies blending colored pencils a little bit for you, and let me know down in the comments what method is your favorite. Personally, I like layering and then of course using the blending stump. So as always, thanks for watching. If you haven't yet already, be sure to subscribe and then hit the bell for notifications because I've got a lot more videos planned. I have a lot more tutorials coming up and plenty of tips videos and a few other things that are going to be pretty fun. So thanks again, and I hope to see you in the next one.